Europe today is in big crisis. A political crisis of legitimacy, as its institutions have become entirely disconnected from its citizens. A social crisis of solidarity, triggered by the global financial meltdown of 2008. A continental security crisis, stemming both from renewed Russian expansionism and from terrorist networks connecting its cities to conflicts in the Middle East. A global existential crisis, as the European Union, this unfinished project, runs the risk of being marginalized in a world dominated by the US-Chinese global condominium. The European project was designed to rescue the nation-state after its near suicide in the battlefields of the Second World War. Faced with internal unrest of populations in shock after 5 years of brutal conflict, as well as with the external threat of an aggressive Soviet empire, Europe's politicians realized that the only path to survival in freedom was to enlist American assistance. President Harry Truman agreed to provide the necessary help, but only if Western Europe pulled its resources together in common economic and military institutions. The Marshall Plan was approved by the US Congress in 1948. NATO was born 1 year later, and the ECSE Treaty, precursor to the EEC and today's European Union, was signed in 1951. France, Italy, Germany, and the 3 Benelux countries delegated their reconstruction to a supranational level of economic governance, the EEC, and their security to a supranational military organization, NATO, both headquartered in Brussels, Belgium. Yet their politicians kept firmly in their hands the political tools of performative legitimation, such as democratic decision-making at ballot boxes and active political participation in deliberative and legislative processes. This allowed for the continuing political relevance of their nation-states and the preservation of their own power and positions. Europe's current crisis stems out of 2 interrelated birth defects. Its politicians' diametrically opposed view on the very nature of the European project, based on their attitudes towards both the EEC, EU, and NATO, and their refusal to allow a truly pan-European political space to emerge, which would facilitate the development of a European demos, or cohesive democratic community, supplementing but not supplanting its many nations. Only such a demos can provide the EU with a vital performative legitimacy without which it cannot withstand severe internal and external crises. But today's EU retains only an indirect strategic legitimacy based solely on its continuing ability to deliver to its citizens peace, prosperity, and participation. At moments of crisis, this indirect formula of legitimacy wanes, and populist feelings of anger and resentment against a supposedly ineffective and unaccountable EU intensify. The 2 key variables defining our politicians' views of the European project can be summarized as support or opposition to a strong NATO, and conceiving the EU either as an intergovernmental organization of sovereign states designed to assist its members in reaching their own national interests, or as a supranational, autonomous actor capable of making and implementing decisions in the interests of the entire organization. The 4 positions emerging out of this matrix are those of the Anglo-Saxon liberal intergovernmentalists, the traditional state nationalists, the Europe First supporters of a European federal superstate, and the Atlanticist integrationists. The Anglo-Saxons favor a strong NATO but a weak EU and support the US strategic hegemonic project. The traditional state nationalists oppose both NATO and a strong EU, as they wish to maintain the central position of their nation-states on the European and international stages. The Europe Firsters strongly support greater European integration, including in the military field, so as to enable the emergence of the EU as an independent superstate and strategic equal to the US, Russia, China, and India. Finally, the Atlanticists favor both a deeply integrated EU and a strong NATO, and thus are the only ones who point the way towards the development of a Euro-American system of multi-level governance beyond the boundaries of the centralized nation-state. The variable geometry conflicts that arise out of these incompatible views of the nature and purpose of the European project, as well as the changing political alliances that shift with every new national election, damage both the efficiency and credibility of the EU institutions and diminish even further whatever strategic legitimacy this project retains in the eyes of European voters, identifying primarily with their own nation-states and remaining deeply mistrustful of the so-called unaccountable Brussels bureaucracy. This is taking place not despite, but in accordance with the very principles of European national politicians, who aim to use supranational institutions of governance to achieve together what they cannot accomplish individually, but at the same time insist to take personal credit for these successes while blaming the overreaching EU for their failures. They can thus both continue to remain masters of the political processes of their own home countries, with all the personal benefits resulting therefrom, and find an easy scapegoat to blame for their political shortcomings. Although the European Parliament is on paper a key institution of the European Union, endowed with significant co-decision powers with the EU Commission and Council, in reality its role is quite limited. Each country elects to the European Parliament slates of parties mirroring their national political organizations. There is no truly coherent and effective coordination of political programs across national boundaries. No truly meaningful debates take into account the common needs of the entire European electorate. European citizens know this and turn out to vote at European elections in much smaller numbers than at national elections. Even then, they do so mostly to register a vote of dissatisfaction with their national governments. A disproportionate number of those who do come to the ballot boxes are supporters of intolerant, xenophobic, anti-EU political parties whose aim to exploit this democratic platform so as to destroy the very European institution they are elected to serve. The most recent 2014 European Parliament elections, which have seen a significant rise in the votes of such radical right-wing parties and therefore in their parliamentary seats, are a vivid example of how democratic institutions lacking democratic legitimacy with their electorate can be misguided towards their own self-destruction. This is the terrible double bind currently affecting the European project. While an increasing number of political and economic tasks can only be successfully tackled at the supranational European level, effective performative legitimacy remains confined by design at the nation-state level. EU's member states can neither transfer additional highly visible tools and symbols of national sovereignty to the supranational level, nor claw back for themselves various powers already ceded to the EU. To do so would result either in a further perceived unaccountable loss of national sovereignty in the eyes of their national electorates, or in a decline of their abilities to respond effectively to the internal and external challenges they now face. Therefore, both options currently available to its member states will further delegitimize their already weakened national political institutions. This explains European politicians' propensity for delay and inaction, and the EU's chronic inability to break out of both the institutional deadlock and the vicious cycle of delegitimization of their national and European levels of government it finds itself mired in at present. Today, the EU is increasingly incapable to deliver on its triple promise of peace, prosperity, participation, for the sake of which 27 sovereign nations were willing to delegate many of their powers to a new supranational level of governance. Some of them are even threatening to bring down the entire post-war continental European structure, which kept the old continent at peace for the longest uninterrupted period since the 19th century Vienna Congress. Metternich's Vienna Congress triggered the beginning of the fourth globalization era, starting in the 1840s and continuing to this day. As newly developing countries emerge from the shadows of the once dominant Euro-American states and become key actors in their own right, the old continent is at a loss as to its heading. In Derrida's prophetic words, Europe today is at a moment in its history, in the history of its culture, when the question of the heading seems unavoidable. It is necessary to make ourselves the guardians of an idea of Europe that consists precisely in not closing itself off in its own identity and in advancing itself in an exemplary way towards what it is not, towards another border structure, another shore. This unprecedented European crisis also offers us a unique opportunity to reach for this other border structure, perhaps our last opportunity to bring about a sustainable and resilient world. We shall see next how to do so, by daring to embrace the Lafayette Gambit and use the vast democratic and participative potential of an already existing but misused and underestimated pan-European institution. The EU Parliament can become the key point of leverage that will enable us to transform first the EU, then NATO, and finally the entire international system, and so bring about in a peaceful and legitimate manner what Andrew Linklater calls a new post-Westphalian structure of governance, more democratic, less unequal, and more sensitive to cultural differences than the territorially defined sovereign nation state. The modern society of states may yet turn out to be the first international society which is not destroyed by conquest and war, but transformed peacefully by the normative commitment to extending the moral and political boundaries of community.